The wind didn't knock on doors, but Elias McCrae always knew when it was coming. It slid under the doorframe, curled around the beams of the wooden house, and whispered through the cracked shutters like an old friend bearing bad news. Some days, the wind was all he had for company. He woke at dawn as he always did, slipping his legs out of the scratchy wool blanket, letting the cold kiss his bones. His boots rested by the bedside, the same spot they'd been in for years. The floorboards creaked under his weight, protesting the routine they'd come to memorize. Coffee boiled on the blackened stove, while the ranch outside stirred, not with people, but with cattle, dust, and silence. Elias didn't talk to himself. He didn't have a dog to chatter to, nor a wife to hum in the kitchen. The sound of human voice had become foreign, almost offensive. He preferred the quiet. It was predictable, honest. Words had failed him when he needed them most. Since then, he had no use for them. He stepped out onto the porch, pulling his coat tighter around his frame. The horizon stretched endlessly, golden brown with hints of green where the stubborn weeds pushed through. The cattle were still in the far west pasture. He'd check on them after mending the fence along the northern ridge. One post had come loose in last night's wind. The house behind him stood proud, though weary. The shingles sagged. The paint had long since peeled. A pair of wind chimes clinked from the corner beam, their tones muted by age and rust. Everything was touched by time. Everything except Elias's eyes, still sharp, gray as the sky on a gunmetal morning. He rode out by mid-morning, saddle creaking, horse breathing slow and steady beneath him. The fence post took him an hour. He didn't rush. There was nowhere to be, no one to impress. The land was his, and always would be, until it wasn't. He could feel it in the soil, in the rhythm of the plains. He was a ghost here, one who hadn't yet figured out how to leave. By afternoon, the sun sat high and hot above the hills. Elias returned to the house, wiped the sweat from his brow, and drank from the tin cup at the well. He didn't eat until sunset. Hunger didn't visit much anymore. It had been replaced by habit, by the echo of a life that once was. He kept a photograph tucked behind the whiskey bottles in the cabinet. He didn't look at it often, but he knew every detail. Her smile, the way her eyes squinted at the corners, the slight curve of her belly. He'd buried them both on the eastern hill, under the sycamore tree that hadn't yet given up the fight. A simple wooden cross marked the spot. No names, no dates, just memory. She'd died coughing, sweating through their mattress in the dead of summer, belly swollen with their first child. The fever had come fast, cruel, unrelenting. By the time the doctor made it out from town, it was already too late. Elias had held her hand, felt her fingers twitch, and then fall still. He'd dug the grave himself, never said a word to anyone. The townfolk had offered casseroles and half-hearted condolences. Then they moved on. But Elias never did. He sold off half the cattle, let the rest wander. He stopped going to church, to town, to anywhere that required more than a nod. The world moved forward, but Elias stayed exactly where she'd left him. That evening, the wind changed. It was subtle at first, just a different texture in the air. But Elias noticed. He always noticed. He stood at the edge of the porch, boots planted, arms folded across his chest. The sky deepened into hues of lavender and rust. Shadows stretched long over the grass. Then he saw them. Figures. Far off at first, nothing more than silhouettes against the dying light. Dust rose around them in a lazy cloud. They came slow, like travelers beaten by distance. Elias narrowed his eyes. 20, maybe more. Men, women, children. No wagons, just tired feet and tired eyes. He didn't move. Let them come closer. When they did, he saw the braids, the blankets, the worn moccasins. Apaches. He hadn't seen one in years. Not since the fighting ended. Not since the treaties. They were supposed to be gone, relocated, erased. But here they were, at his gate, shadows made flesh. They stopped a dozen yards from the porch. The tallest among them stepped forward, a man with a chiseled face, broad shoulders, and the kind of stillness that made the air tense. He didn't carry a weapon, but Elias didn't believe for a second he was unarmed. The man raised a hand, not in threat, in greeting. "My name is Nako," he said, voice steady. "We are seeking shelter, just for tonight." Elias didn't answer. His hand hovered near the rifle leaning against the doorframe. The rest of the group stood still, silent. One woman clutched a sleeping child. Another young girl, maybe 7 or 8, stood barefoot, her eyes wide and unreadable. Elias scanned the horizon behind them. No horses. No wagons. No sign of others. Just dust and weariness. "Keep moving," Elias finally muttered. His voice cracked from disuse. "We've come a long way," Nako said. "There is sickness in the south. Soldiers have taken the rivers. We have no food." "Not my problem," Elias replied. Nako's eyes didn't waver. "We won't stay past dawn." Elias's jaw clenched. He hadn't shared his land with a soul in over a decade. The idea of others on it made his skin crawl. But something about the girl's eyes, the way she didn't flinch, didn't blink, it reminded him of another set of eyes that closed forever on a sweat-soaked pillow. He turned, spit into the dirt, then nodded once. "Barn's open," he said. "Don't touch my horses. Don't wander. You're gone at first light." Nako bowed his head slightly. Not submission, respect. "We thank you." Elias stepped back into the house, shutting the door behind him with more force than necessary. He leaned against it, heart pounding. The air in the room felt heavier than before. He poured himself a shot of whiskey and drank it without pause. Outside he heard them settle. Soft footsteps, murmured words in a language he didn't understand. A baby cried once, then was hushed. A fire crackled somewhere near the barn. He sat in his chair by the window, rifle across his lap, watching. He didn't trust them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But they weren't the first ghosts to visit this land. And tonight, at least, the wind wasn't the only thing speaking. Elias didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window, the rifle cold in his lap, his eyes fixed on the barn where the strangers had taken shelter. The fire they'd built cast faint shadows across the yard, flickering like ghosts against the wood. He watched them move in silence, shapes shifting beneath blankets, the occasional cough, the muted rustle of bodies settling into uneasy sleep. He counted them. 20. Just as he'd guessed, one child whimpered until her mother hushed her. Then stillness returned. The wind came and went. It rattled the shutters and tugged at the corners of the old house, whispering secrets only Elias seemed to hear. It reminded him that nothing ever stayed quiet for long. At some point, the sky softened into dawn, pale streaks of pink bled into gray, and the fire outside died to a glow. Elias rose from his chair, every joint protesting. He rubbed the stiffness from his knees, shouldered his coat, and stepped outside. The air was sharp, crisp with the bite of spring that hadn't yet softened into warmth. He didn't say anything, just walked toward the barn with slow, deliberate steps. Nako stood at the entrance. He hadn't slept. His arms were crossed over his chest, his face still, unreadable. Elias met his eyes for a long moment, then, without a word, turned toward the well. He pulled up the water bucket, filled 2 tin pails, and set them down by the trough. Behind him, the door to the barn creaked as someone stepped out. A woman, slender and tall, her long hair braided down her back. She carried a baby strapped to her chest with a strip of faded cloth. The baby stared at Elias with wide, unblinking eyes. Another child followed her. A little girl, barefoot, her cheeks streaked with dust. She clung to a small wooden carving. An animal of some kind, its features worn smooth. She looked at Elias, not with fear, but with the kind of quiet curiosity he hadn't seen in a child in years. Nako stepped beside them. "I said one night," Elias muttered. Nako nodded. "We understand, but we hoped. I ain't a charity. We don't ask for charity. We offer work. We can fix fences, tend your cattle, whatever's needed." Elias glanced toward the girl who was now crouched by the dirt path, drawing with a stick. She wasn't humming or speaking, just moving the stick in slow, steady lines. A pattern was forming, something round and deliberate. He grunted, "Don't go near the east hill." Nako tilted his head. Understood. The man didn't explain why, and Nako didn't ask. That hill belonged to someone else, someone who hadn't breathed in years but never truly left. Elias turned and walked away, leaving the offer of shelter unspoken, but not withdrawn. He didn't stop them. That was permission enough. The Apaches didn't waste time. Within an hour, the men were mending the corral fence where two boards had split. A younger boy, maybe 12 or 13, followed Elias at a distance, watching how he saddled the horse and checked the feed. The women gathered dry grass and dug out weeds near the cabin. No one begged. No one sat idle. By midday, Elias found himself standing on the porch, coffee in hand, watching them move about the ranch like they belonged. He hated how normal it looked. Like this place had always had people, like the silence hadn't been sacred. The girl with the carving, Tiva, her mother had called her, sat under the sycamore tree by the front gate. She never spoke. Elias hadn't heard a single word from her, not even a whisper. But she watched everything. When he approached the well, she watched. When he fed the chickens, she watched. When he walked to the hill, she stopped what she was doing and followed him with her eyes, until he vanished from view. Elias tried to ignore her. Tried to focus on the rusted hinge on the smokehouse door, or the loose shutter banging against the side of the house. But her silence made his skin itch. She didn't even look afraid, just quiet. Elias didn't know what to do with that. That night, they cooked together over an open fire. The Apaches shared a stew of wild herbs and dried meat. Elias ate in his cabin, but the smell drifted through the air and wrapped around him like a memory. He stared at the cold pan on his stove and pushed it aside. The food tasted like ash. Outside, someone was laughing. A child's laugh. It pierced the quiet like a bell. The next day, Elias rode out to the northern pasture. The cattle were clustered around the stream, the younger calves stamping their hooves in the mud. He checked the far fence and found that someone, probably one of the Apaches, had already reinforced it. The wood was fresh, the nails even. He didn't know how to feel about that. As he rode back toward the ranch, he saw smoke in the distance. For a moment, his heart lurched. Fire. But as he crested the hill, he saw it was just a small cooking fire near the barn. The group had started cleaning the brush along the fence line, piling branches into neat bundles. Elias slowed his horse and dismounted, watching them work. Nako noticed him and walked over, wiping sweat from his brow. "I remember building fences like this," he said. "Before the soldiers burned our village." Elias said nothing. "My people, we are not all warriors. We had farmers, carpenters, mothers who sewed, children who read stories by candlelight." Elias looked at him, the words tasting strange in the dry air. That was a long time ago. Not for us. They stood in silence, listening to the wind carry the sound of voices, of work, of something alive. Then, Nako turned and went back to the others. Elias stood there a while longer. He wanted to tell Nako that the wind didn't care who you were or what you'd lost. It came anyway. It erased names from gravestones and stories from memory. But when he opened his mouth, nothing came. Later that evening, Elias found Tiva sitting by the well. She was carving something with a small knife and a piece of bark. Her mother sat a few feet away, watching with a faint smile. Elias paused, unsure why he'd walked over. "She doesn't speak," the woman said gently. "Not since the last winter. She saw her brother die, starved in her arms. Elias looked down at Tiva. She didn't look up, just kept carving, her hands steady. "She used to sing," the woman said, "even in her sleep. Now, silence." Elias swallowed. "My wife used to sing too." Ayoka turned to him. Her eyes were warm, but guarded. "What happened to her?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Ayoka nodded once, understanding too well the shape of grief. That night, Elias stood at the window again, watching as the firelight danced around the camp. He could hear soft singing. Not Tiva, but another woman. The notes rose and fell like a lullaby. For the first time in years, Elias didn't reach for the whiskey. He just stood there, letting the sound settle into his bones. The next morning, the sheriff came. He rode in with 3 men, all wearing grim expressions. Dust clung to their boots. Their rifles rested loosely against their saddles. Elias met them at the gate. "Morning, Elias," the sheriff said. His voice was tight. Elias didn't respond. "We've been hearing things," the sheriff continued. "Rumors. Says you've got company out here." Elias stared at him. "Now, I don't need to tell you. Folks in town aren't going to take kindly to the idea of savages setting up camp, especially after everything we've seen." "They're not setting up anything," Elias said. "Still, we can't have them here. You know how it looks." Elias glanced toward the barn. Tiva stood in the doorway, watching. "You come to tell me how it looks, or are you here to do something about it?" The sheriff's mouth twitched. "Just a friendly warning. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Elias didn't blink. "This day." The sheriff sighed. "I figured you'd say that." He reached into his coat and handed over an envelope. "Town council's decision. You've got 5 days." He turned his horse, and the others followed. Elias stood there, the letter crumpled in his hand, the dust settling behind them. Tiva was still in the doorway. She raised the wooden carving she'd made and held it up for him to see. It was a figure, small, hunched, wearing a hat like his. Elias didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so he did neither. He just nodded. That night, the wind returned, whispering through the trees and over the porch. But this time, Elias wasn't alone. Rain hadn't touched the ranch in weeks. The grass dried to a brittle yellow, and the dust seemed to cling to the soles of boots like judgment. It gathered in cracks along the porch, nested in the corners of window panes, and coated the fence rails until they creaked under the weight of sun and age. Still, life moved on at McCrae Ranch, steadier now, the routines shifting with the presence of 20 new bodies and the silent ripple they brought. The Apaches had made themselves useful. Fences were fixed, barns repaired, troughs cleaned, and the herd kept safe from wolves that prowled too close in the night. Elias hadn't asked them to work, hadn't demanded their labor. Yet every day he found something quietly mended, straightened, or strengthened. Hands busy without boasting, presence felt without pride. In the evenings, Elias would sit on the porch as he always had, rifle across his lap, cup of black coffee or tin of beans at his side. But now, just beyond the gate, the smell of cooking fires floated in the breeze, mixed with the sound of soft talking in a language that pulsed like water over stones. Children's laughter sometimes broke through, light and sudden like birds scattering from tall grass. It wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, but it was life. Breathing, steady life. Tiva had started leaving her wooden carvings on the porch steps. Small, simple figures. A bird, a horse, a lizard. One morning, Elias found a miniature cow perched on the edge of the porch rail, its legs uneven, its body smooth where her tiny hands had worked the bark. He picked it up, studied it a long while, then placed it beside the lantern. He didn't say thank you. But he left an apple on the well the next morning, just where she liked to sit. When he returned from checking the southern pasture, it was gone. But peace, Elias knew, was like the thin skin over water in a winter trough. It could freeze solid one day and crack under the slightest pressure the next. And the pressure was coming. Granger's Bluff had never taken kindly to difference. It tolerated Elias for his land, his cattle, and the fact that he kept to himself. But word traveled. A horseman had passed through a week ago, caught sight of the Apache campfires, and carried the news back like fire through dry wheat. Since then, the air had changed. Sheriff Dawson's letter sat unopened on the kitchen table for 3 days before Elias touched it again. He hadn't read it the day the sheriff left, didn't need to. He knew what it said, knew what they all meant when they said things like, "keep order," or "protect our borders," or "we've heard rumors." He opened it on the 4th day, hands steady, eyes flat. The words were brief. Signed by the town council, stamped with a notary's seal, legal threats wrapped in polite phrases. He was to evict the Apaches immediately, or be considered in violation of public safety ordinances. A hearing would be scheduled. Further noncompliance would result in forcible removal. The paper trembled once in his grip. Then he folded it, placed it back in the envelope, and burned it in the stove. He didn't tell Nako. Not yet. Instead, he walked the ranch with more purpose than usual, checking every gate, every fence post. He moved feed closer to the house, sharpened his tools. When he noticed 2 of the older boys carrying bundles of firewood past the barn, he called them over and quietly showed them how to load the old lever-action rifle that had sat rusting in the loft. Nako noticed. That night, as the others huddled around the fire to eat, he stepped onto the porch and stood silently beside Elias. "They're coming, aren't they?" he asked. Elias didn't answer right away. He watched the flames flicker in the distance, heard the faint hum of voices, his land alive in ways he hadn't seen in over a decade. "They always come," Elias said. "If you wait long enough." Nako nodded. "My father once said the wind carries truth faster than lies, but the lies last longer." Elias looked over. "You planning to run?" "No." Nako's jaw tightened. "We've run enough." Elias didn't press further. He didn't say that staying might mean dying, or that these plains didn't forgive trespass, no matter how justified. He didn't say that the men of Granger's Bluff had long memories and short tempers. Instead, he nodded once and offered Nako a sip from the tin flask he kept in his coat. The man took it, drank, and handed it back without a word. 2 days later, the preacher arrived. Reverend Charles Abernathy had served Granger's Bluff since before the railroad touched the edge of the territory. He was tall, spare, and sharp-eyed, with a voice that rang like a cracked bell. He wore black from collar to boots and rode a white horse that seemed too noble for its master. He came alone, but his arrival stirred the air like a storm. Elias was in the yard splitting kindling when the preacher reined in near the gate. The Apaches kept their distance, gathering near the barn. Tiva held her mother's hand tightly, her eyes fixed on the tall stranger who smelled of sweat and incense. "Brother McCrae," the preacher said, tipping his hat. Elias wiped his hands on his trousers. "You're not my brother." The preacher smiled thinly. "You're harboring fugitives." "No, I'm offering shelter to people. There's a difference." "They're not our people," the preacher said, voice tightening. "They're not baptized, not civilized. They're dangerous. They're children, women, men who've done more honest work in 2 weeks than some folks in town do in a year." Abernathy dismounted. "You used to come to my sermons. You used to kneel in that chapel and thank God for rain and food. What happened to your faith?" "I buried it," Elias said. "Same day I buried my wife." A flicker of pity crossed the preacher's face, quickly swallowed by righteousness. "Pain clouds judgment. I understand that. But your pain doesn't give you the right to defy your own people." "I'm not defying anyone," Elias said. "I'm just not obeying fear." The preacher walked to the porch steps. "You're putting all of us at risk. Disease. War. If the government hears of this, they'll hear the truth, if anyone's brave enough to speak it." Abernathy pointed toward the barn. "If they're still here by week's end, the town will come, and they won't bring sermons." Elias looked past him, toward the barn, where Tiva stood in the shadows holding a new carving in her hand. A horse this time. A tiny white horse with carved reins. "They're already here," Elias said softly. and they've brought more grace than you ever did." The preacher's face hardened. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode off without blessing or farewell. Elias stood still for a long time after he left. The wind stirred again, and this time it carried something heavier, something darker. That night, the fires were fewer, the voices lower. The camp moved with care, as though the ground might give way beneath their feet. Nako met with the elders and the mothers. They didn't talk of leaving. They talked of bracing. Ahyoka came to Elias just after sunset. She didn't knock, just stood at the edge of the porch, holding a cloth-wrapped bundle. "For you," she said. "Dried meat, cornmeal. You'll need strength." He took it, unsure how to thank her without words. But she nodded as though she heard them anyway. Then, for the first time, she stepped closer. "You're not like them," she said. "I was," Elias murmured. "Once. And now?" He looked at her, at the soft lines etched into her face from sun and sorrow, at the quiet power behind her eyes. "Now I listen more than I speak." Tiva peeked around her mother's skirts, clutching the white horse. Elias knelt down, eye level with her. "That for me." She hesitated, then stepped forward and placed the carving in his hand. It was smooth, carefully detailed. It looked like Abernathy's horse, down to the braided tail. But there was something else. A line carved across the flank. A wound. Deliberate. Elias looked up. Tiva was already back behind her mother's legs. He didn't ask what it meant. That night, he loaded every rifle he owned. And waited. The sky darkened without thunder. No rumble announced the shift. No lightning cracked the horizon. But Elias knew a storm was coming. It began the night after the preacher left. The birds stopped singing. Coyotes, usually heard wailing from the distant hills, fell silent. The air thickened, not with moisture but with something heavier. Dread. Even the cattle seemed to move differently, huddling close together, their heads low. Elias sat at his kitchen table long after the lamps were out, loading shells into a box one by one. He checked the sights on his Winchester rifle 3 times. The old shotgun leaned by the door, oiled and ready. Beneath the floorboards near the hearth, he kept an iron lockbox of ammunition he hadn't touched in years. That box was open now. Outside, the Apache camp had gone still too. No singing, no children's laughter. Nako had posted 2 guards by the barn and another near the far fence. A thin curl of smoke drifted from their fire, more for signal than warmth. It was a symbol, one Elias recognized from a time when he was a soldier, and the people in his fields were enemies. But tonight, he and they were on the same side of the line. Tommy Graves rode in just before midnight. His horse kicked up dust along the trail, hooves slapping the earth in a frantic rhythm. Elias was already on the porch when he arrived. Tommy pulled his mount to a stop so fast it skidded sideways, foam on its flanks. "They're comin'," he panted, half falling from the saddle. "Tonight, maybe an hour out. 20, 30 men, from Granger's Bluff and 2 other towns, some from Red Creek, shotguns, rifles. They mean to burn the place down." Elias didn't curse. He didn't spit. He simply nodded and turned on his heel. "Help me light the perimeter," he said. They worked fast. Oil lanterns hung from fence posts, casting long streaks of light across the field. Buckets of water were drawn from the well. Elias distributed the guns, one to Tommy, another to Nako, another to the eldest Apache boy who had proven himself with traps and snares. Women gathered the children into the root cellar beneath the cabin. Elias handed Ahyoka the key. She looked at him without a word and slipped into the dark with Tiva close behind. By the time the hooves could be heard on the horizon, the defenders were in position. The flames from the lanterns flickered in the wind. The shadows shifted along the fence line. Every heart beat slower but heavier. No one breathed easy. Elias stood at the gate. He recognized some of the riders. Jacob Fields, who sold rope and nails. Martin Blevins, the butcher. Even young Ezra Abernathy, the preacher's hot-blooded nephew, face red and tight with fear disguised as rage. They stopped 10 yards from the gate, their horses snorting, the riders holding rifles at the ready. The sheriff wasn't among them. That didn't surprise Elias. Cowards sent others to carry their threats. Martin nudged his horse forward. "McCrae," he called, "this ain't personal, but we gave you warning." "I read your letter," Elias said flatly. "You don't understand what you're protecting. They've got disease. They're dangerous. They could slit your throat in your sleep." "They've done more for this ranch in 2 weeks than you have in 20 years, Elias snapped back. Someone in the back shouted, "You'll swing for this!" Tommy stepped beside Elias. "You don't want this fight," he called out. "You're on a man's land. This is trespassing." Another voice, young, sharp, unsteady, hollered, "They're savages. We don't let wolves live in our chicken coop." Elias lifted his rifle slowly. "I won't warn again. You come past my gate, and you won't be leaving." The mob hesitated. Then a shot rang out. Elias didn't know who fired first. It didn't matter. The sound shattered the stillness like a thunderclap. The first bullet hit the post beside him. The second tore through one of the lanterns. Fire splashed against the dirt, lighting the night in harsh, dancing colors. Then the barn caught. Elias turned and saw flames licking up the side wall, climbing like desperate hands. He ran, yelling for Nako. The Apache leader had already seen it. He was dragging buckets toward the blaze with 2 young men. Inside, the horses screamed. Another shot cracked through the night, and one of the Apache boys fell. Elias dropped to the dirt, grabbed the boy's rifle, and returned fire. A rider tumbled from his horse. Chaos erupted. Men charged. The fence splintered. Smoke rolled over the yard like a black tide. From the shadows, arrows flew, Nako's last defense. One embedded itself in a rider's chest. Another missed and hit a post. Tommy held the porch with a shotgun, firing from behind a barrel. Every blast echoed like a thunder strike. A body dropped by the gate. Blood darkened the dust. Elias fought with grim precision. Every shot counted. Every movement calculated. He'd fought before. War left its mark on his body, but not his mind. He moved like he had nothing to lose and no reason to stop. Then he saw Tiva. She wasn't in the cellar. She was by the barn. Smoke poured from the broken door. The roof groaned under the weight of flame. She stood frozen, eyes wide, her tiny frame dwarfed by the growing inferno. Elias screamed her name. He didn't know he had until his throat tore. He ran, dodging bullets, ducking past burning beams. He reached her and swept her up in his arms. She clung to him, her tiny hands digging into his shirt, sobbing soundlessly. He turned just as the barn roof collapsed behind him. The heat seared his back. Sparks filled the air. Somewhere in the distance, Nako roared a battle cry. Then, silence. The riders had broken. What was left of them, 6, maybe fewer, were fleeing. Some limped. Others dragged injured friends. Tommy fired one last warning shot into the air. Then the yard fell quiet. Smoke choked the stars. The ground was littered with bodies. Elias stepped over one, a man he'd bought nails from 2 winters ago. His face was unrecognizable. He set Tiva down by the well, poured water over her head, wiped the soot from her cheeks. Ahyoka appeared from the cellar, tears on her face. She collapsed beside her daughter and held her tightly. Elias turned away, throat burning. Nako was lying by the fence. Elias ran to him. Blood soaked his shirt. An arrow was buried in his thigh. But that wasn't what would kill him. A bullet had torn through his side. He looked up at Elias, breath ragged. "We held," he whispered. "You're gonna make it," Elias lied. Nako chuckled, lips coated in red. "Don't waste words." Elias pressed his hands to the wound, but it was no use. "Thank you," Nako said. "For what?" "For letting us be human." His eyes closed before Elias could answer. The night passed slowly. The wounded were tended. The fire died down. Bodies were buried at dawn. No names. Just holes in the earth. Elias stood beside Nako's grave as the sun rose. The wind blew across the plains, cool and soft. For once, it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a sigh. Tiva stepped up beside him. In her hands, a carving. Nako, standing tall, bow in hand. She placed it on the grave and whispered her first word in a long, long time. Warrior. Elias didn't speak. He just knelt beside her, eyes full, heart heavy, and let the wind carry the rest. The sky the next morning bled softly into color, as if the land itself was trying to remember how to breathe. The smoke from the barn had faded to a lazy haze, hovering above the blackened skeleton of what once sheltered animals and hands alike. The ground, still soaked in blood and ash, bore no trace of the stampede, only the silence that followed grief. Grief came heavy, not in tears or wailing, but in the way people moved, with reverence, with caution, as though every step might disturb the ghosts still standing among them. Elias McCrae didn't speak for hours. He walked the length of the yard barefoot, feeling the soot cling to his skin. The rifle that had never left his side for 3 days now rested against the porch rail, unloaded, muzzle dipped toward the earth like a bowed head. The ranch was too quiet. Not silent, but quiet in a way that made the chest hurt. Children whispered instead of playing. Mothers glanced over their shoulders more often than not. Men gathered tools not for building, but for burying. Nako's body lay in the middle of the field, wrapped in a woven blanket that bore the patterns of his people, triangles and lines that meant protection, journey, and sun. Elias had refused to let the others carry him away until the grave was ready. He sat beside the body, a canteen in one hand, a carving knife in the other, shaping a piece of pine from the old fence post into a totem. His fingers were cracked, cut, and calloused by the time he was done. A wolf's head. Strong, alert, sharp-eyed. A leader. They buried Nako as the sun reached its peak. The heat settled over the mourners like a blanket soaked in sorrow. Elias stood beside the grave, the totem resting in his palm. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Instead, he knelt and placed it atop the fresh dirt, one hand lingering for a long second before it dropped to his side. Ahioka stood behind him, one hand on Tiva's shoulder. The little girl held a smooth stone in her hands, carved with a single horizontal line, a symbol she never explained. She placed it beside the totem and walked away without a sound. By evening, the women began to clean. Ash was swept from the steps. The horses were calmed. The cellar, where they'd hidden in the night, was emptied, aired out, and blessed by the oldest among them. Rituals moved in quiet waves. No one asked if they would stay. They had already chosen to. But Elias hadn't gone into town. He hadn't written a letter. He hadn't sent word. He knew the town would be watching, waiting. Maybe they'd come back. Maybe not. Maybe they were too shamed. Maybe they believed the dead had spoken enough. But in Elias's heart, something deeper had rooted, an acceptance that even if they returned, this time he wouldn't bend, and he wouldn't fight alone. 3 days passed. A wagon came up the trail, not from the town, but from the west, a direction seldom traveled. It creaked under the weight of barrels, tools, and supplies. An older man with a thick beard and sun-darkened skin tipped his hat as he pulled into the yard. "Name's Harmon," he said. "Heard tell there was need for lumber and hands." "Got ears in towns that talk more than they ought to." Elias nodded. "We're rebuilding." "That what we're calling it?" Harmon smiled. "Then let's get to work." With him came news. News that spread faster than bullets ever could. Papers in nearby counties had picked up on what happened at the ranch. A mob attack. Bloodshed. A white rancher sheltering Apaches. A child nearly lost to fire. A brave stand. The details were bent, softened, polished, but the core truth was still there. It stirred something in the hearts of people tired of blood and prejudice. Reporters came. Not many, not loud, but enough. Elias didn't like them. He didn't talk to them. But he let them see what they wanted. Ahioka spoke once, briefly. She stood in front of Nako's grave and said, "He died with honor, not hate." That was all. It was enough. Her words ended up on the front page of a regional paper, printed beside a sketch of Elias's cabin with the fire-charred barn in the background. Government officials arrived soon after, dusty boots and shiny buttons. They asked questions, wrote things down. One woman with a badge and soft eyes named Miss Waller sat with Elias on the porch, taking long notes as she listened to the details he gave without decoration. "Do you want them gone?" she asked. "No," Elias said. "Why did you let them stay?" "Because they didn't ask me to lie." That answer, she later told him, made its way into Washington. Within 2 weeks, a letter arrived stamped with the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs seal. It recognized McCrae Ranch as a safe site for transitional Apache families. It granted Elias the legal authority to shelter, employ, and house displaced indigenous peoples under his care. It wasn't much, but it was law. He showed the letter to Ahioka. She read it silently, then folded it and handed it back to him. "Paper doesn't change the land," she said. "No," Elias agreed, "but it gives us time." Rebuilding began in earnest. Harmon brought more hands. A few young men from the town, ashamed of what their fathers had done, came offering help. They kept their heads low. Elias didn't ask questions. He handed them hammers and timber. Forgiveness wasn't a word he used often, but it sat in the quiet between them, like a gate slowly swinging open. One morning, Elias found Tiva standing in front of the new barn's foundation. She held a new carving, a bird this time. It looked like a dove, wings stretched wide. She handed it to him, her eyes no longer shy. "She said you were a wolf," she whispered. Elias blinked. "Who did?" She pointed to the sky. He didn't know what to say, so he knelt down, turned the carving over in his hand, and said, "Wolves and doves don't usually live in the same field." "They do now," she said. Ahioka came that night to the porch. The moonlight wrapped her like silk. Her eyes weren't hard anymore. They were tired but open. She sat beside Elias and handed him a folded cloth. Inside, it was a shirt, handmade, stitched with traditional patterns. "I've been sewing it since the first night we came," she said. "Didn't think we'd stay, but now," he looked at her, at the curve of her jaw, the strength in her shoulders. "You don't have to explain." "I want to." They sat in silence, the kind only people who understand loss can share. "I don't remember the last time I wanted to live somewhere," she whispered, "until now." Elias reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Spring turned to summer. Children ran through the pastures. The cattle grazed quietly. Flowers bloomed along the fence line. The porch had new paint. The roof no longer leaked. Laughter returned. Not constant, not loud, but real. And Elias McCrae, once a man who spoke only to the wind, now woke each morning to voices that called his name. He didn't need to speak much. But when he did, the wind listened. In a land once ruled by silence, a man found his voice not through words but through courage, kindness, and sacrifice. What began as a lonely life guarded by grief became a sanctuary built by trust, shared loss, and unexpected love. And when the winds of the Wild West rose again, it wasn't with the howl of sorrow, but with the promise of something new, a family, a future, a home worth fighting for. If stories like Elias McCrae's touched your heart, where love blossoms in the dust and hope is forged in fire, then don't miss what's coming next. Subscribe now to Wild West Love Chronicles, where every tale is filled with grit, romance, redemption, and the kind of endings that stay with you long after the sun sets. Saddle up and ride with us for more unforgettable stories.